Adel's world was one of fluorescent lights and the low hum of a sleeping office building. He was a creature of the night, a lone sentinel in a sea of empty cubicles, often working until the city outside had long since tucked itself into bed. The silence was his companion, a comfortable blanket that wrapped around him as he typed away, chasing deadlines that seemed to breed in the darkness. One Tuesday, or perhaps it was a Wednesday, the days blurred into one long night. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head with a groan. His eyes drifted to the black mirror of his powered-down monitor. The screen reflected the sterile office behind him. The pale walls, the lonely ficus plant, the neat rows of desks. And then he saw it, a flicker of movement, a shadow, tall and gaunt, detaching itself from the deeper darkness of the far corner. It wasn't his own reflection. His was still, frozen in his chair. This other shape was fluid, a sliver of night that seemed to ripple and sway. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Must be fatigue. He'd been staring at code for 10 hours straight. He shook his head, pushing the image from his mind as he packed his bag. The walk to the elevator felt longer that night. The familiar asterisk ding asterisk of its arrival sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, a primal prickling on the back of his neck that refused to be ignored. The next night, it happened again. He was in the middle of a complex line of code when his screensaver kicked in, turning the monitor into a dark, reflective surface. And there it was. Closer this time, it stood just behind the last row of cubicles, a stark, human-like silhouette against the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. Adel's breath hitched. He spun around in his chair. Nothing. Just the empty, silent office, exactly as it should be. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Was he losing his mind? Was the stress finally cracking him open? He started leaving earlier, abandoning the fortress of his office before true darkness could fall. But the feeling of being watched followed him home. He would be walking down his apartment hallway, the keys jangling in his hand, and he'd catch a glimpse of a dark form retreating around the corner at the far end. It was always just a flash, a trick of the light, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. He started avoiding reflections. He'd turn away from shop windows on the street. In his bathroom, he'd splash water on his face with his eyes closed, drying off quickly before daring to look into the mirror. But one morning, in a moment of groggy forgetfulness, his eyes met his own reflection, and behind his shoulder, peeking out from the edge of the mirror, was the shadow. It was taller now, its form more defined, less like a shadow and more like a man painted in pure black. He stumbled back, his heart seizing in his chest, and when he looked again, it was gone. The paranoia became a constant companion. He felt its presence in the periphery of his vision, in the creak of a floorboard in the empty apartment, in the whisper of wind against his window. He was living on a knife's edge, sleep-deprived and terrified. He started talking to himself, trying to rationalize what was happening. It's a hallucination, he'd say. Stress-induced psychosis. He needed help, but a deeper, more instinctual part of him knew this was real. The company he worked for had recently upgraded its security system. Every employee had access to the live feeds of the office cameras. One night, unable to sleep, Adel logged in from his laptop, a morbid curiosity compelling him. He needed proof. He needed to know if he was truly alone in that office. He clicked through the cameras, his mouse trembling. The main office floor, the kitchen, the server room all empty, bathed in the eerie green glow of night vision. Then he selected the feed for his section. The camera was mounted on the ceiling, offering a bird's-eye view of his desk. He scrolled back the footage to the previous night, to the exact moment he'd seen the shadow in his monitor. He watched his tiny on-screen self lean back, stretch, and then freeze. He saw himself spin around in his chair, and then his stomach dropped. On the security footage, standing directly behind his chair, so close its form seemed to merge with his, was the shadow. It wasn't a reflection. It was there, in the room with him. It had been touching his shoulder. He slammed his laptop shut, a strangled cry escaping his lips. It wasn't in his head. It was real, and it had been close enough to touch him. The realization was worse than the uncertainty. This thing, this entity, was following him. It had been in his office, and now it was in his home. He felt a desperate, clawing need to see it, to confront it, to understand what it wanted. But he was also paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight crushing him. He'd bought a small security camera for his apartment a few weeks ago, a cheap device he'd meant to set up to watch his cat while he was away. He'd forgotten all about it. Now, with fumbling hands, he tore it from its box. He placed it on his bookshelf, pointing it directly at his bed. He didn't know what he expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe that would be a relief. Maybe it would prove he was just going crazy. That night, sleep was an impossible dream. He lay in bed rigid, his ears straining for any sound, his eyes wide open in the dark. He felt a change in the air, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the weather. The silence in his room felt heavier, thicker. He could almost feel the vibrations of a presence sharing the space with him. But he saw nothing. He heard nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won the war against terror, and he drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. The next morning, the first rays of dawn felt like a divine reprieve. He felt hollowed out, but alive. The fear from the night before seemed distant, almost ridiculous in the cheerful morning light. He made coffee his hands steady for the first time in days. He had survived the night. He had imagined it all. With a newfound, fragile confidence, he opened his laptop and pulled up the feed from the camera in his room. He fast-forwarded through the hours of grainy, black and white footage of him tossing and turning. Nothing. Just him, alone in his bed. A wave of relief washed over him so powerful it made him dizzy. It was over. It was all in his head. He was about to close the application when he decided to watch the last few minutes before he woke up. Who's to be sure? He watched himself settle into a deep sleep around 4 a.m. The footage was still, silent. Then, from the corner of the frame, something moved. A darkness bled into the picture, coalescing from the shadows beside his bed. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a figure. Tall, thin, and utterly black. It sat down on the floor next to his bed, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator that knew its prey was sound asleep. Adel's breath caught in his throat. The figure leaned forward, its featureless head tilting as it watched him sleep. It stayed there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. And then, it did something that shattered Adel's sanity into a million pieces. The smooth, dark surface of its face began to stretch and contort. A line appeared, splitting the darkness. It widened, curling up at the edges, pulling the featureless void into a grotesque, impossibly wide grin. The shadow sat beside his bed, watching him sleep, smiling. Adel stared at the screen, at the smiling darkness that had spent the night by his side. The coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. He didn't hear it. The only sound in the world was the frantic, terrified pounding of his own heart. The shadow wasn't following him anymore. It was home.